Hello, hello, everyone. We will give everyone 1 or 2 minutes to jump in, and we'll just open the room, so feel free to come in. And for those of you who are already in the room by now, feel free to put in the chat hello and how you're feeling today, and any chat from you. And we're just going to give it 1 or 2 minutes before we kick off so that we get the people who wanted to join this podcast recording live can do so as well. And this will be out as a podcast later on. And we have opened this up for a few members and people to join it live. So feel free to put in the chat if you're here, and we will kick off shortly. All right. So big welcome to everyone who's here. This is a very, very exciting conversation we're going to have today with none other than James Keyes. I'm very excited for this chat. During the conversation, as this is a live podcast recording and you are flies on the wall, but feel free to contribute to this podcast recording. So put your chats and comments and things in the chat box, and you can also use the Q&A function, and any questions that you have that would really help shape the conversation as well. So feel free to bring in any questions, clarifications, comments, just hit it, and you will be as much part of this podcast as I and Jim are. I am Nelly Wartoft. I'm the chair of Executive Council for Leading Change. And for those of you who don't know the ECLC, my colleague will put a link in the chat with a bit more details about it as well. And we're here today with a very, very special guest, James Keyes. Most people, I think, dream of maybe being a Fortune 500 CEO once in their life, and you've been having that job twice. So how you managed to survive that is another question we have. First with 7-Eleven and then with Blockbuster. And Jim, you're very much the personification of the American dream, I think, like coming from very humble beginnings, and you were the first person in your family to graduate from college and then becoming twice Fortune 500 CEOs, which is a remarkable achievement. And today, Jim is a philanthropist, musician, commercial pilot, and also an author. He just released Education is Freedom as a book in February earlier this year. And that's also the name of the foundation that he runs, which is the Education is Freedom Foundation. And this is a foundation which enables more young people to get through college by helping them to understand the opportunity and navigating the path through college, and also providing scholarships for them. So very, very important work. And Jim, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. It's great to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Nelly. I have enjoyed the chats we've had already. And, I was originally attracted to the opportunity because of the name of the organization. The Executive Council for Leading Change is literally what it's all about. And as you know, I've coined an expression that I put in the book that says CEO, the acronym CEO. While people think it stands for Chief Executive Officer, I've renamed that acronym to Change Equals Opportunity, because it truly is at the root of all commerce, the ability to embrace change and to adapt to it and to leverage it, find the silver lining in any catastrophic situation, is what business is all about and what the American dream is all about, thankfully. So I'm anxious to share with you today some of the stories behind those changes and what they can mean.
Absolutely. And that's so true. It's all about change and leading and driving change, right? And we have a number of people here joining us who are in the position of leading change and are senior change leaders across corporate America. So they will be joining this chat as well. And Jim, I wanted to start with going back to the 23rd of September, 2010. And I was actually going back to this day myself as well, because I remember when we were having a coffee in LA a few weeks ago, it felt like talking to another person of myself, another version of myself. I know we both said that, and we have a lot of things in common. It's funny because when I looked at the 23rd of September 2010, I was actually running a shift at McDonald's that day. And one of the things that you and I have in common is that we both got promoted to shift manager at McDonald's at the same age. So that's what I was doing on 23rd September 2010. But I know you were not at McDonald's that day. You were doing something very, very different that day. So tell us about that day from your perspective. This was the day that Blockbuster filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Tell us about the day from your perspective and what was going through your head that day.
It was a bit of a frustrating experience. As you might imagine, I didn't join Blockbuster with the intent of having to see it through a restructuring. Again, change equals opportunity. It was better than the alternative. It was a Chapter 11 restructuring, not a Chapter 7 liquidation that we were embarking on. So it still represented opportunity, but it wasn't the opportunity that I had anticipated when joining Blockbuster. And in fact, I should probably take you back to a pivotal time in that Blockbuster evolution shortly after I joined the company, but before that date in 2010, when we were forced into a restructuring. Can I take you back a little bit?
Yeah, please, let's do it.
All right, so I'm gonna share a little history, and this is the part of the unknown history of Blockbuster. When I joined the company, it was to embrace change. Clearly, Blockbuster had a transformational opportunity. I saw it as a great candidate to take private. That was my original objective. I wish I had, because having taken Blockbuster private in 2027, in 2007, we would have restructured $1 billion of debt and never batted an eyelash through the financial crisis that ensued. But hindsight's 2020. I didn't know the financial crisis was coming, but we did make progress. Anyway, we left it a public company. I joined in 07. So 1 year later, our earnings report, this was the date, August 7th, 2008. Adjusted EBITDA, so cash flow for the second quarter of 08 improved by $58 million to $28 million. So therefore was negative the period before. So we had a $58 million improvement in our cash flow, reflecting the positive impact of the company's strategic initiatives, including increased availability of top new movies, improved store merchandising, more effective pricing, and a lower cost structure. Good stuff. We ended up raising our guidance for the year to $300 million in cash flow. That doesn't sound like a company that's in trouble, right? $300 million was the expected cash flow guidance for adjusted EBITDA for the year 2008. And Carl Icahn, the largest shareholder and board member, said there's little question that Blockbuster was sick and needed the new medicine that's been administered by Jim Keyes and his team. They are to be highly congratulated. Well, that was good. I felt good about that earnings
That sounds
release.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
2 days later, August 9th, Wired magazine puts out an article that was responding to our recent acquisition of MovieLink. MovieLink was a digital streaming asset. People don't remember that Blockbuster was in digital streaming, but we acquired one of the premium assets that were out there. So this is an article straight out of Wired magazine. And they said, Blockbuster has announced acquisition of the studio-backed video-on-demand site MovieLink. It's not just landing its blows during an escalating price war with Netflix, but Blockbuster has now announced its acquisition of the studio-backed on-demand site MovieLink. Not just the small studios who've helped Blockbuster land this blow either, with the site boasting licensed content from Sony Pictures, Universal, Warner Brothers, MGM, and Paramount. This could easily put the battle-weary rental company in the lead. Make no bones about it, Blockbuster CEO Jim Keyes is more than prepared to tap this union's potential too. So now, we've had a dramatic increase in cash flow reported in our earnings. We acquired a premium asset in digital streaming. It was basically, MovieLink was a company created by the studios to be able to stream movies, not just long old tail subscription content as Netflix eventually began to stream, but also video on demand new releases, which was, by the way, it was 80% of Blockbuster's business was that new release wall. So that was a very important piece of our strategy, of our total access strategy that had actually been built before I acquired, to be able to offer all movies, old movies, new movies, TV, video games, any media content that you wanted. Blockbuster would have it with the most convenient access: stores, by mail, kiosks, or on demand. We had now completed that offering called Total Access. Okay, so that was August 9th, 2008, right?
And just
I'm
to be
going to
clear,
take
because that included streaming as well, right? I think that's an important piece that
absolutely
people don't know. Like that included on-demand streaming online.
on-demand streaming online, not just old movies subscription, but
Yeah.
video on demand as well, which would be new releases. And as I said, that's 80% of Blockbuster's business was new releases. So we had
Mhm.
huge competitive advantage over Netflix for streaming, because
Yeah.
Netflix didn't have video on demand. It was all subscription, still doesn't, right? So, so now 2 weeks later, August 14th, 2008. Good news. I had been pressing the rating agencies for an increase in our debt rating to be able to allow us to restructure, refinance our debt, not through a bankruptcy, but just to talk to the banks and get new financing for the $1 billion of debt that sat on our balance sheet. So I was successful in getting them to increase our debt rating. August 14th, 2008, Moody's Investors, this is the Moody's press release. Moody's Investors today raised the company's secured bank facilities from B1 to B3. This two-notch upgrade reflects the company's improved recovery prospects as a result of the company's notable operating improvement. We're high-fiving, right? Yay, that's great. And then we read the next paragraph. This was the point, August 14th, 2008, that the slide for Blockbuster began. The next paragraph, and let me put this in the context too. The end of September 2008 is when Lehman Brothers collapsed. So now 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, the financial market is in complete disarray. And banks are not sure if they're going to survive. The government's trying to intervene with assistance. The worldwide financial markets were seriously in question. So Moody's, after giving us a two-notch upgrade in our debt rating, then said, at the same time, Moody's downgraded Blockbuster's probability of default. Those are awful words. Probability of default rating. The downgrade considers that despite a notable improvement in operating income and reduction in leverage, Blockbuster still remains highly levered and is faced with the burden of refinancing in a challenging credit environment. That paragraph, that one paragraph that hit the Wall Street Journal, began a domino effect of the speculation of bankruptcy. And as I said, we had already projected a $300 million EBITDA number for the year, cash flow for 2008. That's not a company that looks like it's facing bankruptcy, but the speculation of bankruptcy can often lead to almost an inevitable result, because what it does, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, Nellie, but what that specter created is fear in the eyes of investors, shareholders, other stakeholders, the studios, the movie studios, customers, employees. All of a sudden, there was a specter of bankruptcy that had not been there before for Blockbuster. And that fear ended up being the ultimate culprit that forced a restructuring, as you said, by August of 2010. It gave us no choice.
Yeah. And this was when you were out trying to refinance the debt as well, right? So you were in the middle of the financial markets at that time. You were talking to investors, and you were in those conversations when this article came out. And then, of course, the Lehman Brothers collapse didn't really help your case either, right?
No, Lehman Brothers collapse actually occurred right there at the same timing as that very positive earnings release. But 2 weeks later, by the time Moody's issued their upgrade in our debt rating, they also recognized, because of the Lehman collapse, we may not be able to refinance our debt. Now, where did that $1 billion of debt come from? It's really an interesting story. It goes back to 2004, when Viacom had owned Blockbuster, the movie studio company. Viacom owned Blockbuster and spun them out as a separate company in an IPO. So Blockbuster went from a privately held entity, well, inside of a public company, Viacom, into its own public company. And the bankers at the time said it could handle $1 billion of debt, and it could. We had, as I mentioned, 300 million in cash flow for 2008 was plenty of cash flow to cover that debt. But go forward now from timing 2004, 5 years later, 2009, a substantial portion of that debt came due. That's where, if you had a crystal ball, I would have refinanced all of that debt in 2007, made it through the financial crisis, never batted an eyelash. We wouldn't have skipped a beat. But because we didn't refinance that debt, and now with Moody's increasing our probability of default rating, it made it almost, and with all the banks virtually closed by the summer of, or by the spring of 2009, virtually all banking was shut down for a good year. We did actually get our debt, a portion of our debt, refinanced with the support of JP Morgan and others at a substantially higher interest rate, but we did get it refinanced. The ultimate culprit was not the debt, ironically. And again, I mentioned fear. The ultimate thing that forced our hand on the restructuring was the studio decision to take our credit terms from 90 days to cash. So we had, as you've heard, 6 or 7 major studios that were supporting us. We had 90-day credit terms. Well, in other words, we would buy a movie and rent it 20 times before we ever had to pay for it. So that's a very positive cash flow environment. When the studios were afraid that we were going to file because of all of this negative publicity, all of a sudden they pulled our credit terms from 90 days, made us pay cash in advance. That was a decision by one studio. It was quickly followed by 5 or 6 more studios. It ended up taking 300 million in cash flow out of the company almost overnight, within a 1-week period, which basically forced our hand. At that point, we had no choice but to restructure the company.
And they were also impacted by the fear that Moody's article had set off, and thinking that Blockbuster might not be able to pay that 90-day credit term.
Exactly. Fear.
Yeah. So 2007, that restructuring could have made Blockbuster being where Netflix is today, pretty much.
I think it would have been superior to where Netflix is today, because we were the aggregator of all content. So it would have been the equivalent of Netflix plus Amazon plus Apple. And banged all of that content together. That's what we had offered. In fact, I'll share a story that very few people know. I've been starting to talk about it a little bit, but at the time we had NDAs in place. But we had a deal with Google to be able to have a joint venture where we would be side by side in Google's network, with YouTube being all free content and Blockbuster being all paid content. Now, just imagine the power of that alliance with the Blockbuster brand, the Google distribution network, paired up with YouTube for free and Blockbuster for all paid content. Again, as an aggregator of all content, we also, as part of that deal, had an opportunity, wasn't tied to that deal, but that deal would have given us the confidence to then lock up about 60% of the older movies exclusively. Had we done
Mm.
that, which we would have done with that Google deal, endorsed, signed by the Google board, had we done that, it would have literally left Netflix with very little to stream because we would have had all of that long tail content exclusively. Very interesting opportunity.
Yeah.
When the rumors started to circulate, I believe it was the LA Times that reported on this on this Moody's increase in our probability of default rating and picked up some rumors that Blockbuster may file. When they put out an article saying that Blockbuster was going to file for bankruptcy, was when then I received the call from Google saying, "Sorry, Jim, but we can't proceed until you finish your financial restructuring." I was going,
Mm.
"No, we're not going to restructure. We don't have to restructure. In fact, this deal will absolutely prevent us from having to restructure." But it was too late at that point.
Yeah. So much publicity and rumors and like human psychology at the end of the day, like human psychology winning over financial numbers.
It is. It is.
So,
But you know what, Nelly, it goes back to change equals opportunity. And if there is always opportunity in any crisis, even in a bankruptcy, there is opportunity to find strategic partners, to leverage your negative situation with someone else's strength and to come together. But it's fear that ends up being the single biggest obstacle to leveraging those opportunities. Had
mm,
had Google not been afraid of dealing with Blockbuster's bankruptcy, I think this union could have been a huge windfall for Google as well. The power of the Blockbuster brand combined with their distribution network and our ability to then lock down exclusive content would have put that Blockbuster brand and distribution, Google distribution network, arguably head and shoulders above every other streaming player out there. It would have given us a
yeah,
major competitive advantage. But
yeah,
uncertainty, fear creeps into business decisions, and unfortunately, it kills it kills careers, kills companies, kills opportunity.
yeah. A lot of things come back to fear. And where do you think this case study then came from? Because the famous Harvard case study and the famous like story overall about Blockbuster is that you missed the online streaming, right? Like that's the common belief. And that was
Yeah,
my belief as well before I had that coffee with you. And that's what
yeah.
everyone thinks, that you missed the streaming boat, but you actually had streaming and very good streaming, new releases and so on. Like, where do you think that rumor came from instead of the whole debt restructuring finance side of it?
People are always looking for the easy answer, and the easy answer, the sexy answer is that David beat Goliath, right? That the little
Mm,
scrappy startup Netflix crushed big Blockbuster. And look, I have tremendous respect for Reed Hastings and uh, Mark Randolph and the guys who started Netflix. They had a brilliant idea. They've had great success. Ted Sarandos and the content development, their evolution into new content, into short form or TV content. They've made some brilliant moves. So I have nothing but praise for the guys at Netflix. But I think they would tell you if they were on this podcast that they dodged the bullet several times with Blockbuster coming this close to opportunity that we just couldn't get over the finish line, unfortunately.
yeah. And then like the equity versus that as well, the positioning of being a hot Silicon Valley tech company versus a more traditional giant plays a big part in people's perception of it as well, right?
It is, in fact, you want an analogy. You look at the challenges of Walmart. I hate to, it's hard to have sympathy for Walmart sometimes because they're such massive company. But they're challenging competing with Amazon for many, many,
Mm,
many years. Amazon was not held to the same standard of accountability. It was like, oh yeah, they're losing money, but boy, the future is going to be great. So people were throwing equity at them, right? And meanwhile, if Walmart lost a penny, against their estimate for a quarter, their stock could get slammed by 20%, right? It was almost an unfair comparison of a tech company versus brick and mortar company. But it's the reality. You can complain about it, but it is the reality. People like the growth story of technology. So I was faced with that same thing. Blockbuster is being held to a very different standard than Netflix was as a startup digital company. Even though the irony that in fact, there are a couple of articles that are pretty funny out there where I said at one point in a moment of weakness that I didn't understand the obsession over Netflix and their business model. Well, I didn't. If you think about it, they were doing DVDs by mail and people were calling them a high-tech company. And it was basically an online ordering system is all it was, using snail mail to deliver DVDs, which is nothing that Blockbuster couldn't do and didn't do in exactly the same way. Now, they had a little better recommendation engine, so I'll give them credit for that, but they didn't have, this wasn't rocket science that they had. This wasn't SpaceX that they were building. It was basically a very simple solution for providing access to media entertainment. But it's something that Blockbuster could and did emulate and replicate. It's just that wasn't Blockbuster's core business. That subscription model was really not the core of Blockbuster. As I said, their core traditionally had been access to new releases, that 80% of the business, video on demand, if you will, in today's terms.
Yeah. Yeah, the storytelling and the positioning around it. I like the Amazon Walmart comparison. I think that's a very good comparison because Walmart's revenue far exceeds Amazon's retail revenue, right? But still, they're held to very different perceptions and standards and expectations, which is, yeah, very similar to your case.
Exactly.
And Jim, once this had happened, like after that September, you filed for Chapter 11. You then went off to Florence to paint for a month. Tell us a bit about that experience, like during your painting, because you were on the front cover of New York Post with a Pinocchio nose. I mean, you were a very public face of this big story, right? So how did you think about that after the month when you headed off to Italy to do some painting instead of filing bankruptcies?
Well, I went from excuse me. I went from being the hero in August of 2008, when everybody was congratulating us on our amazing turnaround for Blockbuster, to 2 short years later being the GOAT, who was now blamed for Blockbuster's demise. Yeah, it was pretty tough. You can't help but take it personally. You mentioned the New York Post article where I had a Pinocchio nose. You know, you don't like to get calls from your friends saying, "Hey, you look great with a Pinocchio nose," you know? And the reason for that, of course, is I was out there saying we have no reason to file bankruptcy. We have 90-day credit terms from our studio partners, and by the way, we have very strong cash flow. So yes, we have a need to refinance our debt, but it's not a critical need. We'll be able to get through this. Well, the street didn't believe it, and then when we ultimately filed, of course, they said, "See, told you so." They were going to anyway, and hence the Pinocchio nose. So the learning in all of this, and by the way, you hit the nail on the head. Blockbuster is an amazing business case study. It is a huge disservice to attribute Blockbuster's demise, if you will, to not keeping up with technology. And I'll give you an example. In the year 2000, rumor had it, and apparently it's true, Netflix approached Blockbuster to sell themselves for $50 million. Now, if anybody thinks Blockbuster should have taken that offer, that person should also have bought Netflix stock for 79 cents because it would have been a good value, right? But it's easy in hindsight to go back. Blockbuster, what people don't remember, because it was never publicized, in the year 2000, partnered with Enron. I know it sounds crazy, but to build a streaming video service before anyone was thinking about streaming being a reality. So Blockbuster was way ahead of its time in anticipating, planning, and actually putting chips on the table to develop streaming capability far before anybody else was doing it. This is when Netflix was doing DVDs by mail. So to attribute Blockbuster's challenges to not keeping up the technology is missing so much of the truth and of the real business case study learnings in the Blockbuster case. So I went down a rabbit trail on you because basically your question is, why did I go off and paint for a month? Well, I too had learnings from that experience. And I quote Nelson Mandela a lot, who said, here's a guy locked up in jail for 23 years, but he took that time to learn, to study law, came out, became president of the country. And he says, I never lose. I win or I learn. And my experience at Blockbuster was exactly that. It was not a loss. It was a very challenging time, but it captured huge learnings, probably more learnings in 5 years of Blockbuster than 20 years at 7-Eleven because of the things that I had to experience. And one of those learnings, I'm going to finally answer your question. One of those learnings is that business is not personal. It's easy to look at that negative press and say, oh, gee, woe is me, it's not fair, or it's not true, and blah, blah, blah. It's also not personal. And I had to remind myself that it really wasn't about me. So I needed to just get away. And one of my passions is art. And so I was fortunate to be invited to the Florence Academy of Art for a couple of months just to completely unplug. I learned, I took drawing classes, sculpting, plein air art, painting from the Piazza di Michelangelo, looking out of over the Ponte Vecchio, American tourists coming up, throwing money in my cap, thinking I was some starving Italian artist. Anyway, it was a great opportunity to sort of recharge and to keep reminding myself that my identity was greater than Blockbuster or any individual circumstance, that I had way more to offer to the world and a lot more to do. I think we all need that from time to time.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And what did you think of from a change and transformation perspective? What were some things? Because one of the things that I think about when you're telling this story is that you can drive all the change and transformation that you want, but sometimes there are other factors that are hitting it that might be out of your control or in your control, and they would affect a change as well. So I'm thinking, for the change leaders who are listening to this, what are some learnings that you had around change and transformation from this era?
Yeah, this idea that change equals opportunity, even it sounds crazy, but that change itself could change, right? So you have to be nimble. So here I set out to deal with one kind of change, transformation of Blockbuster from physical stores to digital, and to fund that by improving the physical stores as we made that transition over time to digital. All of a sudden, a year and a half, 2 years into this project, the world financial markets collapse. Now I'm faced with an entirely new kind of change. It was called survival, right? So I went from transformation of Blockbuster to, oh man, now I'm in survival of Blockbuster mode. Throw away all the old playbook, because now it's an entirely new response to change that was required, an entirely new strategy that was required, and yet an entirely new opportunity, because it was in the midst of that crisis that we were able to engage in negotiations with Google that may not have even happened but for that restructuring crisis. Because prior to the bank's collapse, we were going to do this all on our own. We didn't think we needed the support of a Dish Network, who ultimately helped Blockbuster with its restructuring, or a Google or an AT&T or anyone else that had distribution. We were going to do it ourselves. So my point here is that change equals opportunity, whatever the change is. And that change may change into a completely new set of dynamics and a completely new opportunity that you didn't see before. Now, if we were sitting here today and I had successfully completed that transaction with Google, we'd have a very different discussion about Blockbuster being the dominant player in the world today and how successful we were, et cetera, et cetera. It didn't happen, unfortunately, but we were able to put ourselves in a position to potentially make that happen. And that in itself is a huge opportunity.
And there are new opportunities coming out of that as well, with any type of change leads to a new opportunity.
Always new opportunities, always new opportunities.
Yeah. But so many leaders are so fearful of change. And what you mentioned before, fear plays such a big part, unfortunately, in corporate America overall. And I know we chatted at length about this when we had coffee as well, just how much fear there is in so many leaders. And many people just really, really afraid of change, right? Like as senior leaders. Why do you think that is? And what can be done to change that? Because the CEO is really should be, as you said, change equals opportunity, and they should be leading the change. But I see so many CEOs being scared of that. What
It's
do you think
shocking.
can be done?
Shocking.
Yeah.
It is. I swear, fear is the biggest. If you were to step back and truly understand, what kills careers and what kills companies, I swear fear is the biggest culprit, because fear causes inertia, it causes negative reactions. And in the course of writing the book, Education is Freedom, I did a lot of research because I have a chapter in the book, a chapter in here about confidence. And in order to understand and try to direct people to how to build that confidence, I had to try to understand fear and what it is that causes this lack of confidence, right? And and I started looking at neuroscience. I'm not going to get too out there with you, but because I'm not a neuroscientist, but I understood that there is a portion of our brain called the amygdala. And that amygdala goes all the way back to caveman days, and it kept us from being eaten. I mean, let's face it, we had natural predators back then. And we learned circumstances, change would trigger a fight or flight syndrome. And that would often save our life. The ability to, recognize when we need to fight that lion that's attacking us, or when we need to flee and run away. Well, unfortunately, you see that same behavior in the boardroom today. Think about it. We don't have a natural predator, but we get into a board situation and someone challenges us and we're like, ready to fight, ready to go to the mat on issues that you scratch your head and go, really? Is it that important? Or worse, you see the other behavior, like passive aggressive behavior. Oh, yes, that's a good idea. And then, do nothing, right? Those are caveman behaviors. And they are thankfully curable. In my experience, I found that the cure, or my learning to cure them, came from my being a pilot. One of my avocations is flying airplanes, and I train every year. And I realized in a simulator, when they were throwing all kinds of crises at me, change, basically trying to kill me in my own airplane, right? In a simulated environment, I had to learn how to suppress that fight or flight syndrome. Because if you allow that, if a pilot allows that amygdala, that portion of their brain, to take over instead of their frontal cortex or whatever it is, if they allow that instinct to take over, they will either fight the airplane to the point they over control it and tear the wings off, or they flight, they step back, they're afraid to take action, and the airplane spins out of control. Instead, what a pilot does, excuse me, and is trained to do, is to first take a glass of water
Yeah.
and stop coughing.
First thing in the checklist.
First thing in the checklist. Excuse me. Result of international travel. Too much time on airplanes is what it is. And a pilot will turn to that checklist, emergency checklist. That's what they're trained to do. Crisis happens. Very first thing you do, reach for that checklist, bring it out. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. Now, why are they doing that? They're doing that because they're suppressing that fear syndrome by going to data, knowledge, facts. And that's what we're trained to do as pilots. You want your pilot, next time you're on a commercial airliner, to do that, to have that reflex, not to have the fight or flight response. And that's the difference between using knowledge to make decisions or letting your emotions and letting your instinct kick in. Whether you're in a boardroom, an aircraft cockpit, or the halls of Congress, it would be a good idea to use knowledge and facts rather than emotion and reaction to change.
Yeah, and that's something you need to do rather consciously, right? Like leaders are also pretty emotionally controlled many times. So having that conscious checklist of checking facts first.
Exactly. And it's, I mean, you can see it in the difference between solid leaders and weak leaders. It's not the change that matters. It's their response to change that makes all the difference between winners and losers. And we forget that sometimes. We think it's, we react, but it's that reaction to change. Are you making that reaction based on facts, based on knowledge, based on critical thinking? Or are you reverting to your caveman brain and you're ready to fight over something without full knowledge of what you're fighting over?
Yeah, and having that self-awareness as well to know when that is happening and when to kick in the different systems. Because a big part of it is also identity, right? I know we spoke about this as well, like the identity, and especially for CEOs, many CEOs feel like their identity is being a CEO, and if that identity is threatened, and they might feel like I am losing my status, power, CEO role, whatever it might be, I don't want to change the business because then what's going to happen to me, right? Which is the same case for pretty much a lot of people in the business. But how do you think that leaders can rework their identities to become a bit more agile and skilled at leading through that uncertainty that change and transformation actually requires you to do?
Yeah. Well, the first most important thing is to recognize, well, self-awareness for starters, to recognize how you deal with change. And are you reverting to that caveman instinct and reaction, or are you using data, critical thinking, call it the scientific method, to truly understand what's going on and to have a rational response, and then step back from it and use data to modify your response if needed. I think as leaders, we all have that responsibility to have that self-awareness. But I think most of us are not really seeing any change as true opportunity. And it's really, I'm surprised as I go around the country talking about the book, Education is Freedom, and about an important foundation of that book being able to respond to change and seeing change, even the most horrible, soul-crushing thing that could happen can create an opportunity. And if you don't take advantage of it, someone else is likely to come in and do it. But we often don't look at it that way. So that's my message to leaders, is to recognize there's no static solution to being a good leader. Leadership is dynamic. It's about being
Mm.
able to adapt to any circumstance. And I think if we can all increase our own level of self-awareness, and if we can all embrace change, as it's going to happen one way or another, particularly if it's external or macro change, there's really nothing you can do about it. How you respond to it is really what will make the difference between success and failure.
Yeah. I really like the saying also, strong beliefs loosely held, to be able to change your beliefs at any point in time. Because I remember the story that you told me about your 7-Eleven board member, I think it was, that was just like really didn't want any convenience at the to pay at the pump, right? They wanted
Yes.
people to go into the store. And that was someone like that had very strongly held beliefs and didn't really want to change his mind, right?
Yeah, it was for the audience listening in. It was the advent of new technology. It was pay at the pump technology, which I'm just old enough to remember when that first came in. And previously, convenience stores, especially 7-Eleven, had people go inside to pay because they were afraid of drive-offs. They didn't want to have people pump the gasoline and then go in to pay. So they'd make you go in first, pay for the gasoline, then go out and pump it. It was actually quite inconvenient to do that. So when these card readers came in, I looked at it as new technology. This is great. It's a new level of convenience for customers. Our One of our board members saw it in a quite different light because he said, "You don't understand, Jim. The reason that we have gasoline at 7-Eleven is to force people to come inside to pay, so they buy something else inside." And I thought, well, isn't that a little inconsistent with the definition of convenience? What's our business really? Is our business forcing people into the store to buy merchandise, or is it being the most convenient place to buy gasoline or merchandise or anything? Anyway, it came down to that caveman response. I mean, he was ready to go to battle. It was dukes up, Literally, I think he said, "Over my dead body will we ever put those things in my stores." I was like, okay. Um, then he died a couple. No, I'm kidding. He didn't really die, but he ended up not fighting it ultimately to the death. But he did resist it for a long, long time, and we ultimately did put the card readers in, and the result was we increased. This is the irony in the whole thing. We increased inside sales after putting the electronic card readers in. Why? Because gasoline sales went up. We were more convenient. More convenient. People went inside. They'd put their card in, have their gas be pumped while they went inside, bought something. So inside sales increased. It's a great case study.
Paradoxal.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is a great case study in that, like, fear and just like the initial reaction and how it can actually be contradictory to what you're actually trying to achieve as the end outcome.
Exactly. Exactly. I have so many stories of peers, other CEOs, major companies, global companies, saying, "Jim, I'm not going to put my career at risk for that silly test that you'd like to do." And you go,
Mm.
"It's a test, you know. How how hard is how much jeopardy is your career going to be in by testing a new method of distribution or a new method of, product packaging or something?" But that fear is real.
Yeah. And especially the way they prioritize careers when they might have another 2 or 3 years in the CEO post, right? And they would rather have that role for the next 2 to 3 years than making a change that is going to benefit the company for the next 10, 20 years, because they don't really give a shit about the next 10, 20 years. They just care about the last CEO tenure that they have. It gets in the way many times. But tell us a bit about you, Jim, because I mean, you didn't become a twice Fortune 500 CEO by not changing yourself as well. So tell us about the changes that you've been going through in your own life, and how did you become the CEO of 7-Eleven and then Blockbuster? What were the changes you were tackling?
Sure. Apologize for the the byproduct of my international travel, by the way. Um, yeah, I think I was a bit of a unique case in that throughout my career, I did take chance. I did take pretty extreme chances. And by chances, I don't mean irresponsible risk. I mean stepping out from the pack at risk of being fired. I didn't really care if they fired me because my attitude was always, if I'm making decisions and taking positions based on data and based on facts, and they still fire me, then I'm probably not in the right environment anyway. Now, there's two ways to advance your career. You can either take the safe route and take very little risk. Excuse me. I'm going to apologize for a second and go offline and get a cough drop if I
No
can.
worries. Yeah, no problem. Go for it. Go for it. I haven't come back. Yeah, the international travel, too many airplanes catching viruses everywhere. If anyone has any questions for Jim, feel free to share them. We've got about another 5 to 10 minutes or so, and then we'll wrap up. But any questions that you have, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll bring them in for Jim once he's back from his cough drop. And this will also be published in the upcoming podcast. So we're actually launching an ECLC podcast in July, which we will be excited to tell you about soon. And we're back.
We're back. Thank you.
Cough drop helps. Awesome.
I think that'll help. Yep. Okay, so where were we? Oh, we're talking about two ways. Yeah, there's two paths to the CEO chair. You can be a really good soldier, take very little risk, obviously do your job, but achieve that promotion by basically tenure. Over time, you get promoted from one chair to the next, and eventually you might be CEO. Or you can take the more aggressive route of pushing the envelope, differentiating yourself by being a change agent, and the company will either embrace that or reject it. And it may reject you. And as I said, the way I looked at it is, if a company rejects me because I'm a change agent, making change based on data and facts that are good for the company for the long term, then I'm probably not in the right environment. And so my approach was always the latter. And I broke a little glass along the way. Maybe I broke a lot of glass along the way. But ultimately it worked. And I think the company was better off for it. And I certainly, professionally was better off for it.
Yeah. If you're driving change in an environment that doesn't appreciate it, then, as you said, then you're probably not in the right place, right? You want to be in a place that appreciates change and wants to transform. Otherwise, the place is going to cease to exist pretty soon too. That's true.
Exactly.
And tell us about your passion for education and where that comes from as well, because I'm going to ask you to leave us with the book that you've just released and tell us about that book a bit and why you believe education is so key in all of this.
I do. It started out, certainly it was my personal path to, I call it freedom. Education is freedom because in my case, it really wasn't about money. It was be able to have flexibility to do anything in life I want to do, whether it's learn how to be an artist or, fly airplanes or run a big company. I feel like it's just about learning to learn. And so if I have any advantage or skill set over anybody else, it's not that I'm any smarter than anybody else. My friends will tell you that. My family will tell you that. But it is that I've learned how to learn. So there's virtually nothing that stands as an obstacle to me because I know now how to learn how to do it, whatever it is. And I'm very confident in that ability to learn. So I discovered early on that the more my team could also learn how to learn, the better off we would be. And I set out to share those same principles for learning, basically with Blockbuster, with 7-Eleven, But I also had another epiphany in that, take 7-Eleven as an example. You look around, you see how many first generation Americans there are in 7-Eleven stores. And now look at Subway, look at so many other chains, and you see all these first generation Americans, and you go, I wonder why that is. And the reason for it, in many cases, is the first generation American came with a belief in the American dream and a recognition that hard work and knowledge can translate into opportunity. So here we had 7-Eleven stores in urban areas where whole portions of these cities had thousands and thousands of public school kids that said, well, there's no opportunity for me, there's no jobs. And all they had to do is stay in high school, get an associate's degree or 4-year degree. We'd help them do that. And they could be a store manager at $50,000 a year and then work their way through the system. So the original motivation for the foundation Education is Freedom came from the desire it was a practical supply and demand issue. We would demand for an educated workforce at 7-Eleven. We had 400,000 employees. We didn't have sufficient supply. And so we said, let's go build it. Let's go into public schools and show them the path to success, to use education as a path to opportunity in the corporate world. So yeah, I'm very much a believer that corporations represent the demand for an educated workforce. And corporations are too often, we're sitting on the sidelines saying, well, we'll let state and local government figure that out. I think we've got an opportunity now, especially in this age, the information age, to step up. And my book is a bit of a call to action for people in business to recognize if we're the demand, if we do recognize there's a supply problem of educated employees, then let's come together and harness technology to transform education the same way technology transformed video rentals or retail or space, right? We can do that with education, but someone's got to lead the charge.
Yeah. And if corporations have that need, then be part of the solution as well, and don't just think someone else will solve it.
Exactly. In fact, 100 years ago, it was the Rockefellers and the Mellons, and it was the big industrialists that recognized the need for an educated workforce. So they virtually built the public school system that we know today. If you wonder why public education is highly standardized, it goes back to Henry Ford's approach to industrialization, right? It's just mass production of an educated workforce is what we did. Standardized testing, standardize everything, put everybody into a box and spit out educated workers. We've been teaching and learning that way for 100 years. Now we're in the industrial age. It's time for us to teach and learn an entirely different method. And corporations, being the demand, should, I think, step up and say, hey, I've got this, just as we did 100 years ago.
Yeah, 100% agree. And paying their taxes as well, not evading taxes by royalties in the Netherlands and not contributing to the education system as well.
Exactly.
That's a great note to end. Thank you so much, Jim. This has been an incredible conversation. I have so many takeaways around fear and how that gets into the way, and identity, how leaders should have their identities worked out around agility and not that fight or flight system, and how change equals opportunity, and that many times things are not always what you believe them to be either. So thank you so much for sharing your story with us, and sharing all of these insights from your incredible experience that you've had. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much, everyone who tuned in. And this will be out as a podcast episode as well in about a month or so. Thank you, everyone.